Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. Jake sat frozen on his bike, the roar of the engine rumbling beneath him. The words, "someone you don't want to meet," echoed ominously in his head. He glanced at Lyra, whose tense posture and darting eyes made it clear she wasn't exaggerating. "Okay," he said finally. "Where do you need to go?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze shifting to the horizon, as if calculating something. "Far away from here. Somewhere secluded where I can stay hidden for a while." Jake sighed. "Lady, this whole desert is secluded. You're gonna have to be a little more specific." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Then somewhere with tools. I'll need to work on my equipment." He thought for a moment. "There's an old workshop about 30 miles from here. Belonged to a friend of mine before he moved away. It's empty now, but there's still some gear lying around. That work for you?" Lyra nodded. "That will do. But we need to leave. Now." Jake raised an eyebrow. "What's the rush? You said someone's coming." His words were cut off by a sudden, low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Lyra's eyes widened. She grabbed Jake's arm with surprising strength. "That's why. We need to go. Now." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He revved the engine and gestured for her to hop on. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second before climbing on behind him, her grip tight around his waist. The motorcycle tore down the desert highway, kicking up dust as the hum grew louder, morphing into a menacing drone. Jake risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. A sleek, black craft was descending from the sky, its surface glinting in the fading sunlight. It moved with unnatural smoothness, as if it were slicing through the air rather than flying. "What is that?" Jake shouted over the wind. "A hunter's ship," Lyra replied, her voice tight with fear. "Keep going." Jake gritted his teeth and leaned into the throttle, pushing the bike as fast as it could go. The craft was gaining on them, its eerie hum growing louder. "Do you have a plan?" he called back. "Just keep driving," Lyra yelled. The craft swooped lower, and Jake felt a jolt as a burst of energy crackled past them, narrowly missing the bike. "Great plan," he shouted sarcastically. "Turn left up ahead," Lyra ordered. Jake spotted the faint outline of a dirt path veering off the main road and swerved onto it. The terrain was rough, and the bike jolted violently as they sped along the uneven ground. "Why are we going this way?" Jake asked. "The ship is faster in open space," Lyra explained. "The terrain will slow it down." Jake wasn't sure how much faith he had in that logic, but he didn't have time to argue. The craft fired another energy burst, this one striking a rock just ahead of them and sending debris flying. "This thing doesn't give up, does it?" Jake muttered. "It won't," Lyra said grimly. "Not until it has me." Jake wanted to ask what made her so important, but now didn't seem like the time. He focused on maneuvering the bike through the rough terrain, his muscles straining as he fought to keep control. Ahead, the dirt path wound through a narrow canyon, the towering walls offering some cover. Jake pushed the bike harder, the sound of the hunter's craft echoing ominously behind them. As they entered the canyon, the ship slowed, its sleek design struggling to navigate the tight space. Jake smirked despite himself. "Looks like your plan might actually work," he said. Lyra didn't respond. She was staring intently at a device on her wrist, its screen flashing with strange symbols. "Hey, what's that?" Jake asked, nodding toward the device. "Tracker," Lyra said absently. "It's how they're following us." Jake's eyes narrowed. "And you just now mentioned this?" "I needed time to disable it," Lyra snapped. "Keep driving." She fiddled with the device, her fingers moving with practiced precision. Suddenly, the screen went dark, and the hum of the hunter's craft faltered. "Did you?" Jake began. Yes, Lyra interrupted. The signal's blocked. For now. The craft hovered at the entrance to the canyon, its movements uncertain. After a moment, it turned and flew off in the opposite direction. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, that was fun. Lyra didn't respond. She was staring at the horizon, her expression unreadable. You okay? Jake asked. I will be, she said softly. Jake nodded, deciding not to press her. He turned his attention back to the path ahead. The canyon opened up into a wide expanse of desert, and in the distance, he could see the faint outline of the workshop he'd mentioned earlier. There it is, he said, pointing. Lyra followed his gaze and nodded. Good. Let's hope it has what I need. They reached the workshop just as the last light of day faded. The building was small and unassuming, its metal walls rusted from years of neglect. Jake parked the bike and dismounted, stretching his sore muscles. Home sweet home, he said, gesturing to the workshop. Lyra didn't respond. She was already scanning the area, her eyes sharp and alert. Relax, Jake said. Nobody comes out here. Let's hope you're right, Lyra muttered. They entered the workshop, and Lyra immediately began rummaging through the scattered tools and equipment. Jake watched her for a moment before speaking. So, he said, leaning against a workbench, you gonna tell me what's going on? Who's after you, and why? Lyra paused, her hand hovering over a strange piece of machinery. She turned to face him, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of determination and fear. I stole something, she said finally. Something important. Jake raised an eyebrow. Important how? Lyra hesitated, then pulled a small, glowing orb from a compartment in her suit. The light it emitted was mesmerizing, shifting between colors in a way that seemed almost alive. This, she said, holding it up. It's called a core. It's a source of unimaginable power. In the wrong hands, it could destroy entire worlds. Jake stared at the orb, his mind racing. And let me guess, the guy chasing us wants it. Lyra nodded. Vorex. He's a bounty hunter, but he works for people who would use the core for destruction. Jake let out a low whistle. Well, you sure know how to get yourself into trouble. Lyra's expression hardened. I didn't have a choice. If I'd left it with them, they would have used it to enslave more planets. I couldn't let that happen. Jake studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. Guess we'd better figure out how to keep you out of his hands. Lyra looked surprised. You're willing to help? Jake shrugged. You fixed my bike. Besides, I'm already in this mess. Might as well see it through. A small smile tugged at the corners of Lyra's mouth. Thank you, Jake. Don't mention it, he said, grinning. Now, let's figure out our next move. The workshop was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the core in Lyra's hands. Jake leaned against a rusty tool cabinet, watching as she delicately placed the orb onto the workbench. Its colors shifted mesmerizingly, casting strange shadows across the room. So, Jake said, crossing his arms, you're telling me that little glow stick is the reason we were almost vaporized back there? Lyra gave him a sharp look. The core isn't a glow stick. It's a multidimensional power source capable of bending the laws of physics. If it falls into the wrong hands, the consequences would be catastrophic. Jake raised an eyebrow. Sounds serious. Why not just destroy it? She sighed, running a hand through her silver hair. It's not that simple. The core isn't just energy, it's alive. Destroying it would be like killing something. I can't do that. Jake studied her, sensing the weight of her words. For a moment, he almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Well, Lyra, I hate to break it to you, but keeping it alive might get us both killed, he said. What's the plan? Hide out here forever. No, Lyra said firmly. We need to find a way to neutralize the core's signal permanently. As long as it's broadcasting, Vorex will keep hunting us. Jake frowned. And you think this old junkyard has what you need to pull that off? It's a start, Lyra said, already sifting through the scattered tools and spare parts. Jake watched her work for a moment before sighing and stepping forward. All right, let's say I'm in. What do you need me to do? Lyra glanced at him, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. You're willing to help? Jake shrugged. Not like I've got much of a choice. Your hunter buddy probably won't stop with just you. If he figures out I helped you, I'm a dead man, too. She hesitated, then nodded. Fair point. Fine. Start by finding me anything with a high-frequency resonator. It'll look like a small coil wrapped in copper. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He started rummaging through the piles of parts, trying to make sense of the alien girl's request. As they worked, an uneasy silence settled over the workshop. Finally, Jake broke it. So, this Vorex guy, he said, what's his deal? Is he, like, some kind of alien Terminator? Lyra paused, a faint smirk tugging at her lips. In a way. He's not a machine, though. Vorex is a Zakarian, a race bred for combat and tracking. They're relentless, and they don't take failure lightly. Great, Jake muttered. And you thought it was a good idea to steal from someone who could send a guy like that after you? Lyra's expression hardened. It wasn't a choice. The people who had the core were using it to enslave entire planets. I couldn't let that continue. Jake nodded slowly. All right, fair enough. Still, seems like a hell of a risk. Some things are worth the risk, she said quietly, turning back to her work. Jake didn't press further. Instead, he focused on finding the resonator Lyra had asked for. After several minutes of searching, he held up a small, coiled device. This what you're looking for? Lyra glanced at it and nodded. Perfect. Hand it over. Jake tossed it to her, and she caught it deftly. Within seconds, she had it integrated into a makeshift device that looked like a cross between a radio and a toaster. What is that thing? Jake asked. A signal scrambler, Lyra said. If it works, it should mask the core's energy signature and buy us some time. Should. Lyra gave him a withering look. Do you have a better idea? Jake held up his hands. Fair enough. Do your thing. She powered up the device, and a low hum filled the workshop. The core's glow dimmed slightly, its shifting colors stabilizing. Lyra let out a relieved breath. It's working. For now. Jake leaned against the workbench, studying her. So, what happens next? You just keep running forever. Lyra shook her head. I need to find someone who can help me safely extract and store the core's energy. Someone with the resources and knowledge to handle it properly. And where are we supposed to find someone like that? Jake asked. Lyra hesitated. There's a contact of mine, an old ally, who might be able to help. He's on the other side of the continent. Jake's jaw dropped. The other side of the continent? You're kidding, right? Do you have any idea how long that'll take on a motorcycle? Do you have a better option? She shot back. Jake groaned. All right, fine. But if we're doing this, we're gonna need supplies. And I'm gonna need coffee. A lot of coffee. Lyra allowed herself a small smile. Agreed. As they began to prepare for their journey, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. But as he watched Lyra work, her determination and focus unwavering, he realized there was no turning back now. Guess we're really doing this, he muttered to himself. Lyra glanced at him. What was that? Nothing, Jake said quickly. Just wondering what I've gotten myself into. Lyra's smile widened ever so slightly. You're not the only one. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the desert in hues of orange and gold, as Jake revved the motorcycle's engine. Beside him, Lyra secured the makeshift containment device holding the core inside a reinforced saddlebag. She glanced up, her violet eyes scanning the horizon with a mixture of determination and unease. Ready? Jake asked, adjusting his gloves. Lyra nodded. The longer we stay here, the more likely Vorex finds us. We need to move. Jake smirked. Not exactly a ringing endorsement of our safety, but okay. Let's ride. They took off, the motorcycle roaring down the dirt road as dust kicked up behind them. The open desert stretched endlessly in every direction, giving Jake a strange sense of freedom despite the danger. Lyra, seated behind him, clung tightly as they sped toward the nearest highway. You sure your friend can help us? Jake called over the wind. If anyone can, it's him, Lyra replied. But reaching him won't be easy. Yeah, I figured that much, Jake muttered. They merged onto a paved road, the smooth asphalt a welcome change from the rough terrain. The miles ticked by in relative silence, with only the steady rumble of the engine and the occasional gust of wind breaking the quiet. But the calm didn't last. A sudden, high-pitched whine filled the air, growing louder by the second. Jake's grip tightened on the handlebars as he glanced upward. Tell me that's not what I think it is, he said. Lyra looked up and paled. A sleek, black craft streaked across the sky, its shadow passing over them like a dark omen. It's Vorex, she said, her voice laced with urgency. He must have recalibrated his sensors. The scrambler's not enough to hide us anymore. Fantastic, Jake said through gritted teeth. Hold on. He twisted the throttle, and the motorcycle surged forward, its engine roaring as they raced down the highway. The craft descended, its engines emitting an eerie hum as it closed the distance. Can't this thing go any faster? Lyra shouted. It's not exactly a spaceship. Jake snapped. The craft fired a pulse of energy that slammed into the road behind them, sending shards of asphalt flying. Jake swerved, narrowly avoiding the debris. Okay, we're sitting ducks out here, he yelled. We need cover. Lyra scanned the area and pointed to a cluster of rocky outcroppings in the distance. There. Head for those rocks. Jake veered off the highway, the bike skidding slightly as it transitioned onto the sandy terrain. The uneven ground made the ride rough, but the rocks offered the only hope of breaking Vorex's line of sight. The craft fired again, this time missing by mere feet. The shockwave nearly knocked them off the bike, but Jake managed to keep control. Almost there. Lyra called out, her voice barely audible over the noise. They reached the rocks and ducked into a narrow crevice just as the craft flew overhead. Jake killed the engine, and they sat in tense silence, listening to the sound of the ship circling above. Lyra's breathing was heavy, her hand resting on the saddlebag that held the core. He's scanning for us, she whispered. Jake wiped sweat from his brow. Great. What do we do now? Wait for him to get bored? No, Lyra said firmly. He won't leave until he's sure we're gone, or until he has the core. Jake frowned, his mind racing. We need a distraction. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. But what kind of distraction? Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small bundle of firecrackers. Seriously? Lyra said, raising an eyebrow. Hey, don't knock it, Jake replied. These things are louder than they look. Lyra sighed. Fine. But make it count. Jake carefully lit the firecrackers and tossed them toward an open area beyond the rocks. They exploded in a series of sharp pops, echoing across the desert. The craft immediately veered toward the noise, its sensors drawn to the sudden burst of sound and light. Now's our chance, Jake whispered. Let's move. They pushed the motorcycle through the rocky terrain as quietly as possible, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the hunter's ship. After several tense minutes, they reached a small canyon that offered better cover. Jake restarted the bike, and they continued their journey, sticking to back roads and avoiding open spaces. By the time they stopped to refuel at an abandoned gas station, the sun was high in the sky, and the oppressive heat was making Jake's shirt stick to his back. Lyra paced nervously while Jake siphoned gas from a rusty pump. He's not going to stop, she said. Yeah, I kinda figured that out, Jake replied. Lyra stopped pacing and looked at him. Why are you helping me? Jake shrugged. Honestly? I'm not even sure. Maybe I'm just too stubborn to back out now. Lyra studied him for a moment, then nodded. Well, for what it's worth, I appreciate it. Don't get all sentimental on me, Jake said with a smirk. We've still got a long way to go. As they prepared to leave, Jake's eyes caught movement in the distance. A dust cloud was rising on the horizon, heading straight for them. Lyra, he said, pointing. She turned, her expression darkening. That's not Vorex. Those are ground units. Ground units? Jake repeated. Vorex must have called for reinforcements, Lyra explained. They'll surround us if we don't move now. Jake groaned. Of course he has backup. Why wouldn't he? They jumped back onto the motorcycle and sped off, the distant vehicles closing in. As the chase continued, Jake couldn't help but wonder what he'd gotten himself into. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. Jake and Lyra tore across the barren desert, the motorcycle's engine screaming against the backdrop of roaring wind and the steady hum of pursuing vehicles. Jake stole a glance over his shoulder and cursed under his breath. 3 sleek, armored hovercrafts were closing in fast, their dark exteriors gleaming under the relentless sun. Each one was bristling with weaponry, their occupants barely visible behind tinted windshields. Any bright ideas? Jake shouted over the roar of the engine. Keep going. Lyra replied, gripping him tighter. We need to find higher ground. Higher ground? Jake shot back. What are we, Jedi? But he scanned the horizon anyway, searching for anything that might give them an advantage. Up ahead, he spotted a ridge of jagged rocks that rose sharply from the desert floor. That'll have to do, he muttered, veering toward the ridge. The bike bounced and skidded as they left the flat desert for the rougher terrain, the hovercrafts hot on their trail. Jake gritted his teeth, weaving between boulders and narrowly avoiding loose rocks that threatened to send them sprawling. Can't this thing go any faster? Lyra demanded. Lady, this isn't a starship. Jake snapped. You want faster, get out and push. The first hovercraft opened fire, a series of plasma bolts sizzling past them and exploding against the rocks. Jake swerved wildly to avoid the blasts, his heart pounding in his chest. Okay, this is officially the worst road trip I've ever been on, he shouted. Lyra ignored him, her attention focused on the saddlebag holding the core. She pulled out a handheld device covered in glowing alien symbols and began fiddling with it. What are you doing? Jake asked. Giving us a chance, she said through gritted teeth. Just keep driving. Jake didn't have time to argue. He pushed the motorcycle harder, the engine straining as they climbed the ridge. The hovercrafts were relentless, their pilots expertly navigating the rough terrain. One of them surged ahead, cutting off their escape route. The hovercraft's turret swiveled toward them, and Jake's stomach dropped. Hold on, he yelled, yanking the handlebars hard to the left. The bike skidded dangerously close to the edge of the ridge, loose gravel tumbling down the steep incline. Jake fought to keep them upright, his knuckles white on the handlebars. The hovercraft fired, the plasma bolt narrowly missing them and carving a smoking crater into the ground. Jake swore under his breath. I'm open to suggestions, he called back to Lyra. Keep them off us for 10 more seconds, she shouted. Jake clenched his jaw. 10 seconds? No problem. I'll just defy death a little longer. He swerved again, narrowly avoiding another plasma burst. The second hovercraft was closing in now, its weapons lighting up as it prepared to fire. Lyra suddenly leaned over, her device emitting a high-pitched whine. She aimed it at the nearest hovercraft and pressed a button. A pulse of energy shot out, striking the hovercraft's engines. The vehicle wobbled, then careened out of control, crashing into a boulder and erupting in a fiery explosion. Jake let out a whoop. Nice shot. Don't celebrate yet, Lyra said, already aiming at the second craft. She fired again, but this time, the pilot was ready. The hovercraft dodged the pulse and retaliated with a volley of plasma bolts that forced Jake to veer sharply to the right. Any chance you've got more tricks up your sleeve? Jake asked. I'm working on it. Lyra snapped, frantically adjusting her device. The third hovercraft was now flanking them, its weapons trained on the bike. Jake knew they couldn't keep this up much longer. As if sensing his desperation, Lyra suddenly shouted, "Head for that canyon up ahead." Jake spotted the narrow opening she was pointing to and nodded. You got it. He gunned the engine, the bike surging forward as the canyon loomed closer. The walls were steep and jagged, barely wide enough to accommodate the motorcycle. Are you sure about this? Jake yelled. Just go. Lyra replied. They entered the canyon, the rocky walls rushing past in a blur. The hovercrafts hesitated at the entrance, their pilots clearly wary of the tight space. Jake smirked. Looks like they're not as crazy as we are. But his relief was short-lived. The lead hovercraft activated a set of retractable wings, narrowing its profile as it entered the canyon. Of course they have that, Jake muttered. The chase continued, the canyon's twists and turns forcing Jake to maneuver with precision. The hovercraft was relentless, its weapons firing sporadically as it struggled to maintain its speed. Lyra fired another pulse, but the narrow space made it difficult to aim. The hovercraft dodged easily, its pilot clearly skilled. We're running out of options. Jake shouted. Not yet, Lyra said, her voice calm despite the chaos. She adjusted her device one last time and aimed it at the canyon walls. With a determined look, she pressed the button. A powerful energy wave erupted from the device, striking the walls and triggering a massive rockslide. Hang on! Lyra yelled. Jake ducked as boulders rained down around them, blocking the path behind them and forcing the hovercraft to come to an abrupt halt. When the dust settled, Jake slowed the bike and looked back. The hovercrafts were trapped, their pilots scrambling to find a way through the rubble. Jake let out a shaky laugh. Remind me never to doubt you again. Lyra smiled faintly. I'll hold you to that. They emerged from the canyon and found themselves in a wide, open plain. Jake stopped the bike and turned to Lyra. All right, we bought ourselves some time. What's the plan now? Lyra took a deep breath, her expression serious. We keep moving. The rendezvous point isn't far now. Jake nodded. All right. Let's finish this. As they set off again, the horizon stretched endlessly before them, filled with both danger and the faint hope of salvation. The endless plain stretched before them, the horizon shimmering with heat waves. Jake pushed the motorcycle to its limits, the tires kicking up a trail of dust as they sped onward. Behind them, the craggy outline of the canyon faded into the distance. How much further? Jake shouted over the roar of the engine. Not far, Lyra replied, her voice barely audible above the wind. She checked the alien device strapped to her wrist, its glowing symbols shifting rapidly. A few more miles, maybe. Jake grunted in response, his focus locked on the barren expanse ahead. The desert felt unnervingly quiet now, the absence of the hovercraft's pursuit offering little comfort. Why do I get the feeling it's too quiet? he muttered. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tightened her grip on his shoulders, her unease evident. Because it probably is. Moments later, a faint vibration beneath the bike caught Jake's attention. At first, he thought it was the engine, but the sensation grew stronger, accompanied by a low rumble. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, glancing back at Lyra. Her eyes widened. "They've sent ground drones." Jake groaned. "Of course they have. What are we dealing with this time?" Before she could answer, the source of the rumbling became clear. 3 sleek, spider-like drones crested a nearby hill, their metal legs skittering effortlessly over the rocky terrain. Each one was armed with dual plasma cannons, their red optics glowing ominously. "Great. Giant metal spiders. My day just keeps getting better," Jake muttered. "Head for the rocks on the left." Lyra shouted. "We need cover." Jake veered sharply, the motorcycle skidding slightly as he adjusted course. The drones reacted instantly, their legs propelling them forward with unnerving speed. Plasma bolts rained down around them, kicking up dirt and debris. Jake zigzagged to avoid the fire, his heart pounding as the drones closed the distance. "This isn't working," Jake yelled. Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rummaged through the saddlebag and pulled out a small, spherical device. "What's that?" Jake asked, his tone skeptical. "A last resort," Lyra said grimly. She twisted the sphere, and it began to emit a high-pitched whine. With a flick of her wrist, she hurled it toward the nearest drone. The sphere detonated midair, releasing a pulse of blue energy that sent the drone tumbling. Its legs twitched spasmodically as it collapsed in a heap of sparking metal. "One down, 2 to go," Jake shouted, accelerating toward the rocks. The remaining drones adapted quickly, their movements becoming more erratic as they tried to flank the bike. Lyra fired another pulse from her handheld device, but this time the drones dodged easily, their agility making them difficult targets. Jake cursed under his breath. "Any more of those magic grenades?" Lyra shook her head. "That was the only one." Figures. Just as the situation seemed dire, a deafening roar filled the air. A sleek, silver aircraft swooped down from the sky, its weapons lighting up as it fired on the drones. "What the?" Jake started. Lyra's eyes widened in recognition. "It's him." "Him who?" Jake demanded, weaving around a rock as the aircraft's precision strikes took out another drone. "An ally," Lyra said, relief evident in her voice. The remaining drone attempted to retreat, but the aircraft was relentless. Within moments, it was reduced to a smoking pile of scrap. Jake brought the motorcycle to a stop, his breathing ragged as the aircraft hovered above them. A moment later, it descended, landing gracefully on the rocky ground. The craft's hatch opened, and a tall figure stepped out. He was humanoid but distinctly alien, his silver skin glinting in the sunlight. His sharp, angular features and piercing blue eyes gave him an otherworldly presence. "Lyra," the figure said, his voice smooth and commanding. "I see you've made some interesting friends." "Reiner," Lyra said, her tone a mixture of relief and irritation. "You have no idea how glad I am to see you." Jake dismounted the bike, eyeing the newcomer warily. "Friend of yours?" "An old ally," Lyra replied. "Reiner, this is Jake. He's been helping me." Reiner's gaze flicked to Jake, his expression unreadable. "A human? Interesting choice." Jake crossed his arms. "Yeah, well, I didn't exactly volunteer for this gig." Reiner smirked. "Fair enough." He turned back to Lyra, his tone becoming serious. "We don't have much time. Vorex's forces are converging on this area. I've set up a secure extraction point, but we need to move now. Do you have a way to neutralize the core's signal?" Lyra asked. Reiner nodded. I have the equipment aboard my ship. But once we start, it will take time. We'll be vulnerable until the process is complete. Jake groaned. Great. More running and dodging plasma bolts. My favorite. Reiner ignored him, motioning toward his ship. Get aboard. We'll discuss the plan on the way. Reluctantly, Jake and Lyra followed him into the sleek interior of the craft. The cockpit was a marvel of advanced technology, its controls glowing with soft blue light. Reiner took the pilot's seat and began inputting coordinates. The extraction point is in a mountain range a few hundred miles from here. It's isolated and defensible, but we'll need to act fast. Lyra nodded. Understood. Jake settled into a seat, feeling out of place amid the alien technology. So, what's the plan if Vorex shows up before we're ready? Reiner glanced back at him, his expression grim. Then we fight. Jake sighed. Figures. As the ship lifted off, Jake stared out the window, watching the desert blur into a golden haze. Despite the danger, a small part of him couldn't help but marvel at the situation he found himself in. What the hell have I gotten myself into? He muttered. Lyra glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Welcome to the fight, Jake. Jake leaned back in his seat, bracing himself for whatever came next. The sleek alien craft glided silently over the barren desert, its advanced cloaking system rendering it nearly invisible against the shimmering heat waves. Jake sat tensely in one of the rear seats, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon outside the window. So, he said, breaking the silence, what's the deal with you two? Old friends? Partners? Something more? Lyra shot him a look, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. Reiner and I work together on a few missions. He's reliable, if a bit dramatic. Reiner smirked from the pilot's seat. I prefer charismatic. But yes, Lyra and I have faced our share of close calls. Jake raised an eyebrow. And this is just another day at the office for you two? Not quite, Reiner said, his tone serious now. The core you're carrying has drawn the attention of one of the most dangerous mercenaries in the galaxy. Vorex won't stop until he has it, or until we're all dead. Jake frowned. Good to know. Thanks for the pep talk. Lyra leaned forward, studying the holographic map projected on the ship's console. The extraction point, is it secure? Reiner nodded. A small cavern system in the mountains. Perfect for hiding and setting up the equipment to neutralize the core's signal. Jake tapped his fingers on the armrest. What happens after that? You just, take it somewhere else. We destroy it, Lyra said firmly. Jake blinked. Destroy it? After all this trouble to protect it? Lyra's gaze was unflinching. It's too dangerous to exist. If Vorex, or anyone, gets their hands on it, entire civilizations could be wiped out. Jake leaned back, processing her words. No pressure, then. Suddenly, the ship's console emitted a sharp warning tone. Reiner's expression darkened as he checked the readings. Vorex's forces, he said. They've tracked us. Jake felt his stomach drop. How? I thought this thing was supposed to be stealthy. Reiner's fingers danced over the controls. It is, but they must have deployed long-range scanners. They're tenacious, I'll give them that. Lyra stood, steadying herself as the ship banked sharply. How much time do we have? Not enough, Reiner replied. They'll intercept us before we reach the extraction point. Jake groaned. Let me guess, we fight? Reiner's lips curled into a grim smile. Precisely. The ship accelerated, skimming low over the terrain as the first of Vorex's ships appeared on the radar. 3 sleek interceptors fanned out in pursuit, their engines glowing ominously. Strap in, Reiner said. This is going to get rough. The first salvo of plasma bolts streaked past the ship, narrowly missing the hull. Reiner maneuvered expertly, rolling and diving to evade the enemy fire. Lyra braced herself against the wall, her eyes fixed on the approaching ships. We can't outrun them forever. Do you have any offensive capabilities? Reiner smirked. Do you even have to ask? With a flick of a switch, the ship's rear cannons activated, swiveling into position. A barrage of energy bolts erupted from the craft, forcing the interceptors to scatter. Jake clung to his seat, his heart pounding as the battle unfolded around him. I take it this isn't your first dogfight? Hardly, Reiner replied, his focus unwavering. The interceptors regrouped, their coordinated attacks growing more aggressive. One of them managed to score a hit on the ship's wing, causing a brief but intense jolt. Shields holding, Reiner said, though his tone was less confident now. Lyra grabbed her handheld device and activated its interface. If we can't lose them, we need to take them out. Jake, can you handle a weapon? Jake blinked. You're asking me that now. Do you want to live or not? Lyra shot back. Jake groaned and unbuckled his harness. Fine, but don't blame me if I blow something up. Lyra led him to a secondary console, where a holographic targeting system flickered to life. This controls the forward cannons. Aim and fire. It's that simple. Jake hesitated, then took the controls. Simple, she says. The interceptors closed in again, their weapons lighting up the sky. Jake gritted his teeth and squeezed the trigger, sending a volley of energy blasts toward the nearest enemy ship. To his surprise, one of the shots connected, striking the interceptor's engine. The craft spiraled out of control before exploding in a fiery burst. Jake let out a whoop. Did you see that? I got one. Don't get cocky, Lyra warned. The remaining interceptors pressed the attack, their fire growing more precise. Reiner's ship took another hit, this time to the rear thrusters. Damage is getting critical, Reiner said, his voice tense. We need to end this. Lyra stepped up beside Jake, her expression determined. Aim for the lead ship's cockpit. Take out the pilot. Jake swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. No pressure, right? Just focus, Lyra said, her tone firm but not unkind. Jake adjusted his aim, tracking the lead interceptor as it swooped in for another pass. Time seemed to slow as he lined up the shot, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then, with a deep breath, he fired. The energy blast streaked across the sky, hitting its mark with devastating precision. The interceptor exploded, leaving only one remaining. Reiner seized the opportunity, swinging the ship around and unleashing a barrage of cannon fire. The final interceptor didn't stand a chance, its debris scattering across the desert below. Silence fell as the battle ended, the only sound the hum of the ship's engines. Jake slumped back in his seat, his adrenaline finally starting to fade. I can't believe we made it, he said, his voice shaky. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. You did good, Jake. Reiner glanced back at them, his expression grim but satisfied. We're not out of the woods yet, but that bought us some time. Let's make it count. The ship resumed its course, heading toward the distant mountains. As the extraction point drew closer, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only just beginning. The alien craft descended into the shadowy valley where jagged peaks loomed like sentinels. Below, a network of caves carved into the mountains offered a natural fortress. Reiner guided the ship toward a flat outcropping near the largest cavern. This is it, he said, his tone clipped. We'll be safe here, at least for a little while. Jake peered out the viewport. Safe. After that sky battle, forgive me if I don't feel reassured. Lyra ignored Jake's sarcasm, her focus on the core nestled in the saddlebag. The signal will draw more of Vorex's forces if we don't shut it down. Reiner, do you have everything we need? Reiner motioned toward the cargo hold. The equipment is ready. But the process will take time, and once we activate it, there's no turning back. Vorax will know exactly where we are. Jake unstrapped himself from his seat, exhaustion and anxiety vying for dominance. How much time are we talking? 30 minutes, maybe 40, Reiner said, already heading to the hold. If they find us before it's done, we'll need to defend the position. Defend it? Jake muttered. Against what, exactly? More giant robots? Laser-shooting hovercrafts? Killer space cats? Lyra shot him a sharp look. We knew this was going to be dangerous. Yeah, but I thought dangerous meant bar fights and engine trouble, not galactic death squads. Reiner smirked. Welcome to our world, human. Jake followed the others as they unloaded a series of strange, angular devices from the cargo hold. They carried the equipment into the largest cavern, where the air was cooler and heavy with the scent of damp stone. Lyra set the core on a metal pedestal at the cavern's center. Its faint blue glow seemed to pulse in time with the faint hum emanating from the devices Reiner was setting up around it. What exactly is this thing doing? Jake asked, gesturing to the array of machines. We're creating a containment field, Reiner explained. It will block the core's signal long enough to destabilize its energy matrix. Once it's destabilized, the core will self-destruct. Jake nodded slowly. Sounds complicated and explosive. Lyra adjusted one of the devices, her expression tense. It's the only way. As they worked, Jake found himself pacing near the cavern's entrance. His nerves were on edge, every distant sound putting him on high alert. This place feels too exposed, he muttered. Lyra joined him, her expression softening slightly. It's natural to be nervous. Nervous? Jake said, gesturing toward the equipment. I'm surrounded by alien tech, being hunted by a guy who probably has Galactic Warlord on his resume. Nervous doesn't begin to cover it. Lyra smiled faintly. You're still here, aren't you? That says something. Before Jake could respond, Reiner's voice cut through the tension. The field is ready. I'm activating it now. The devices around the core came to life, their blue light intensifying as a shimmering barrier formed around the artifact. A low, resonant hum filled the cavern, reverberating through the walls. Now we wait, Reiner said. Jake didn't like the way that sounded. Wait for what? Reiner's expression darkened. For them. It didn't take long. Less than 15 minutes after the containment field was activated, a sharp, high-pitched tone echoed through the valley. Lyra's head snapped up. Drop ships. Multiple. Jake cursed under his breath. And here I was hoping for some downtime. The three of them rushed to the cavern's entrance, where the sight of Vorax's forces confirmed their worst fears. A trio of sleek black drop ships descended from the sky, their hulls bristling with weaponry. As the ships touched down, squads of armored soldiers poured out, their movements precise and coordinated. They're not wasting any time, Jake muttered, his stomach churning. Good, Reiner said, his tone icy. Neither are we. He handed Jake a compact weapon that looked like a hybrid of a rifle and a flamethrower. Know how to use one of these? Jake hefted the weapon, trying to look more confident than he felt. Point and shoot, right? Close enough, Reiner said. Lyra grabbed her own weapon, a sleek energy pistol that glowed faintly in her hand. She turned to Jake, her expression serious. We hold the line. No matter what happens, the core must be destroyed. Got it, Jake said, though his voice wavered slightly. The first wave of soldiers advanced toward the cavern, their blaster fire lighting up the dark valley. Reiner took cover behind a boulder, returning fire with pinpoint accuracy. Lyra followed suit, her shots precise and calculated. Jake hesitated for a split second before joining them, his adrenaline kicking in as he fired at the approaching soldiers. The alien weapon in his hands recoiled differently than anything he'd used before, but he quickly adapted. One of the soldiers lobbed a grenade toward their position, the explosive landing dangerously close. "Grenade!" Jake shouted, diving out of the way. Reiner reacted instantly, using a small device to deflect the grenade back toward the enemy. The explosion scattered the advancing soldiers, buying them precious seconds. "This is insane!" Jake yelled over the chaos. "You're doing fine," Lyra said, firing at another soldier. "Define fine." The battle raged on, the enemy forces relentless in their assault. Reiner's ship provided some support, its automated turrets picking off soldiers from above, but it wasn't enough to turn the tide. Jake's arms ached from the constant recoil, and his breathing grew ragged. Despite their efforts, the enemy was closing in. "We're running out of time," Lyra shouted. Reiner glanced back toward the core. "The field needs another 5 minutes. Hold them off." Jake gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He spotted a heavy soldier advancing with a shield generator and fired at the device, disabling it. "That's one way to make an impression," he muttered. Just as it seemed they might be overwhelmed, a deafening roar shook the valley. A massive explosion erupted near one of the drop ships, sending soldiers flying. Jake turned, stunned, to see another ship descending from the sky. "Reinforcements?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. Lyra smiled grimly. "Not exactly. That's one of Reiner's contingency plans." The new ship unleashed a barrage of missiles, scattering the remaining enemy forces. Reiner called out, his voice firm. "The core's almost destabilized. Get ready to retreat." Jake felt a flicker of hope as the tide began to turn, but he knew the fight was far from over, the valley was chaos. Smoke and fire obscured the landscape, and the echoes of plasma fire reverberated off the rocky walls. Jake clutched the alien rifle, his arms trembling from exertion. He had never fought for his life like this before, but there was no time to dwell on it. Reiner barked orders from behind cover, his sharp eyes scanning the battlefield. "Lyra, take out that cannon. Jake, stay on their flanks. We just need a few more minutes. Minutes we might not have." Jake shouted back, ducking as another explosion rocked the cavern entrance. Lyra, undeterred, moved with precision. She vaulted over debris, her energy pistol blazing as she targeted a mounted plasma cannon. A well-placed shot sent it sparking and exploding, forcing the enemy soldiers to scatter. "Cannon neutralized," she called out. Jake peeked over his cover, firing at a group of soldiers attempting to push forward. His shots hit their mark, but more were already advancing to take their place. "There's too many of them," Jake yelled, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Reiner, crouched beside a boulder, reloaded his weapon with practiced efficiency. "They're stalling. Vorex himself will be here soon." Jake froze for a moment. "You're saying that guy is coming here?" "Personally." Lyra crouched next to him, her violet eyes blazing with determination. "Vorex never lets someone else finish his job. If he's coming, it means we're close to the end." "That's supposed to be comforting?" Jake asked, sweat dripping down his face. "No," Lyra replied grimly. "But it means we've got his attention." Inside the cavern, the core glowed brighter than ever, the containment field around it humming with increasing intensity. The devices Reiner had set up emitted waves of energy, disrupting the core's deadly signal bit by bit. 2 more minutes. Reiner shouted over the commotion. But those 2 minutes felt like an eternity. A shadow fell over the battlefield, and a new sound filled the air, the deep, resonant hum of an approaching warship. The enemy soldiers paused in their advance, their movements more deliberate now. Lyra's expression hardened. "He's here." Jake followed her gaze as a sleek, angular craft descended from the sky, its black hull shimmering with a menacing aura. The ship landed just beyond the enemy lines, and from it emerged a towering figure clad in dark, intricately designed armor. Vorex. Even from a distance, his presence was suffocating. His armor pulsed with red energy, and his eyes, glowing like embers, scanned the battlefield with cold calculation. He carried a massive weapon that looked like a hybrid of a sword and a cannon, its edges crackling with raw power. "Great," Jake muttered. "A supervillain with a sword gun. Because why not?" Reiner stepped forward, his voice steady despite the overwhelming odds. "Vorex," he called out, his tone sharp and defiant. "This is your last chance to turn back." Vorex laughed, a deep, guttural sound that sent chills down Jake's spine. Bold words for a man outnumbered and outgunned. He raised his weapon, pointing it toward the cavern. "Give me the core, and I may let you live." "Not happening," Lyra snapped, stepping up beside Reiner. Jake, still crouched behind cover, groaned. Why does everyone always have to antagonize the guy with the big gun? Vorex tilted his head, his expression unreadable behind his helmet. "So be it." With a gesture, he commanded his forces to attack. The soldiers surged forward with renewed vigor, their firepower focused on the cavern entrance. Jake, Lyra, and Reiner fought desperately to hold the line. Jake's arms felt like lead, but he kept firing, taking down enemy after enemy. Lyra moved like a dancer, her shots precise and devastating. Reiner, wielding an alien blade, engaged the soldiers who got too close, his movements a blur of deadly efficiency. But Vorex was unstoppable. He strode through the chaos with chilling ease, deflecting shots with his weapon, cutting down anyone in his path. "He's coming straight for the core," Jake shouted. "Not if I can help it." Reiner growled, charging toward Vorex. The two clashed in a blinding display of energy and steel. Vorex's strikes were brutal, each one sending shockwaves through the air. Reiner parried and countered with equal ferocity, their battle becoming the center of the chaos. Jake and Lyra could only watch in awe and terror as the two warriors fought. "Reiner can't hold him off forever," Lyra said, her voice tight with urgency. "The core's almost destabilized. We just need a few more seconds." Jake nodded, though fear gripped him. "What do we do?" Lyra grabbed his arm, her eyes locking onto his. "We finish this." They turned back to the core, where the containment field was now surging with energy. The devices around it beeped in rapid succession, signaling the final stage of the destabilization process. "We need to activate the manual override," Lyra said, pointing to a console near the core. "But it'll leave us exposed." Jake hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "I'll do it. Cover me." Without waiting for a response, he sprinted toward the console. Plasma fire rained down around him, but he kept moving, his heart pounding in his chest. Reaching the console, he quickly studied the alien symbols on its surface. "Okay, Jake," he muttered to himself. "Time to hope you're good at guessing." Lyra provided cover, her shots keeping the soldiers at bay. Jake's fingers flew over the controls, and with a final press, the console emitted a loud chime. The core's glow intensified, its hum reaching a deafening pitch. "It's done," Jake shouted, turning back to Lyra. But his relief was short-lived. Vorex, having overpowered Reiner, now stood at the cavern entrance, his weapon raised. "No!" Lyra cried, firing at him, but he deflected the shots effortlessly. Jake froze as Vorex aimed at the core. But before the warlord could fire, Reiner, bloodied but unyielding, lunged at him from behind. His blade pierced Vorex's armor, and the warlord roared in rage. The distraction was enough. The core released a blinding surge of energy, its containment field collapsing as it detonated in a wave of light. The shockwave threw everyone to the ground, the cavern shaking violently. When the light finally faded, the core was gone, its power obliterated. Vorex, injured and disoriented, staggered to his feet. He glared at Lyra, Jake, and Reiner, his voice a low growl. "This isn't over." Before they could stop him, he activated a device on his wrist and vanished in a burst of red light. Silence fell over the battlefield. Jake lay on the ground, staring at the cavern ceiling, his body aching and his ears ringing. "Tell me that worked." Lyra knelt beside him, her face breaking into a tired smile. "It worked." Reiner approached, battered but alive. "The core is destroyed. The signal is gone." Jake let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over him. "We're alive. We actually did it." Lyra helped him to his feet, her hand resting on his shoulder. "You did good, Jake." He smiled weakly. "Yeah, but next time, let's save the galaxy without me." Lyra laughed, the sound a rare moment of warmth amidst the devastation. For now, at least, the fight was over. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. For more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon, so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.